make a comparison between what they're doing, which they call the gay rights movement, and the civil rights movement from the 60s. And even the name is intentionally picked, I think, to make a connection here, a parallel between these two things. So what they perceive themselves as doing is this. They perceive themselves as taking these rights that began to be understood and explored in the past and given to people that should have been given to them. And they're saying, well, we're just expanding that more and more rights to more and more people who deserve those rights, and that's what we're doing. And they sort of are piggybacking on the civil rights movement. But the other side of that is this. What they're also saying is, if you don't go along with the gay rights movement, then you're right in line with the people who resisted the civil rights movement. People who were haters, who were bigoted, who were prejudiced, and that's the reason that they were against the civil rights movement. If you're against the gay rights movement, you must be a hater and a bigot. You must be intolerant. You must be uncompassionate. And that's what they want you to think. They want you to make that connection. Is that a proper parallel between those two ideas? I suggest to you that it's clearly not a proper parallel between those two ideas, because the civil rights movement was not dealing with a sexual perversion. When the civil rights movement said we ought to integrate the military, what's wrong with that idea? You know, unless you are a bigot of some kind, I don't see how you can stand it. That's a perfectly righteous movement. But when you say, should we integrate the military with homosexuals, we're imposing a perversion on the military. That's a qualitatively different thing. When people stood against interracial marriages, that was a prejudice that they had. Nature, as a matter of fact, doesn't see anything wrong with interracial marriages. Why do I know that? Because interracial couples don't have any more trouble procreating than people of the same race. But people of the same gender can't procreate under any circumstances, see, because we're dealing with a sexual perversion. So the parallel that they're trying to make is an unjust parallel. And let me put it this way. The only thing that's parallel between the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement is the name. And once you go any deeper than that, the differences are substantial. But they want to make that parallel. And then another argument that they use is the argument that they're in a morally superior position to you because they are more compassionate than you are. Question mark. They're more tolerant, they're more humane, they are more accepting of behavior that you just have a bigoted response to. And so they're claiming to have the moral high ground. Is that really true? Is your compassion measured by your willingness to normalize a sexual perversion? I'd like to express it that way. Well, let's take a behavior that we all agree is a perverse behavior, at least any rational person would agree. Let's take bestiality, people who want to have sex with animals. Suppose I said this, I'm on a cause, okay, and my cause is get you to normalize bestiality. I want to impose bestiality on the military so people can practice that openly in the military. I want to teach your children in grade school to accept bestiality uncritically. That there's nothing wrong with that behavior. So as I said last week, I'm going to write a book called Heather Has a Daddy and a Duck. And your children are going to have to read that in grade school so that they learn to accept this behavior without thinking of it critically or judgmentally. And I want a guy who's having sex with a goat to be able to be considered a legal marriage in this country. And anybody who stands against this agenda of mine is uncompassionate. Does that make sense? Why? Because if the behavior you're talking about is a sexual perversion, it's not uncompassionate to refuse to normalize it, it's irrational to normalize it. And I say this, true compassion, when it comes to someone engaged in a sexual perversion, is one and only one thing, and that is to encourage them to stop. And anything that parades itself around as if it were real compassion, anything else is just a misguided sense of compassion. True compassion or true tolerance or true humanity when it comes to a sexual perversion is to encourage them and help them and show them how to change and how to stop. Not to run around and say, this is a sexual perversion, so my answer is try to get the whole society to believe that in fact isn't a perversion and that it's perfectly normal behavior, and anybody who stands against that is intolerant and uncompassionate. I think that's an intimidating argument, but when you scratch the surface, there's nothing to it really. And then another thing they promote is not just the general normalization of homosexuality, but let's talk just a little bit about gay marriage. Question mark. Gay marriage. To go to the specific issue of gay marriage, I think they run into a second problem. They have a huge problem, generally speaking. If you want to normalize a behavior that's quite apparently and transparently and inescapably a sexual perversion when you look at the behavior itself, it's hard to escape that conclusion. But now you want to go to the point of gay marriage as well. To me, that forces them to climb two mountains that they can't take the first step in the direction of climbing. In order to convince someone about gay marriage, they would first of all have to climb the mountain of proving that the behavior is normal, because if you're going to encode something in the laws of a country, something that's that serious, the laws regulate the society, as if it were a normal behavior, you're going to have to prove that that behavior is normal. So, but we've been talking about that forever, and the whole last tape was about that their inability to prove that the behavior is normal. So they have that mountain to climb. What argument can they use to prove that homosexuality is normal? Well, the only argument they've ever used is number one up here, and we repeated that last week in a way that I don't think that they can ever come back from. So that's one mountain they have to climb, but let's suppose for a moment, we'll just play pretend for a moment, that someone could take a magic wand and wave it over the gay rights advocates, and they could prove to you beyond any shadow of a doubt that homosexual behavior is normal behavior. That there's an overwhelming reason to believe that trumps any reason on the other side. Have they won the debate about gay marriage? No. Why? Because it's possible, theoretically, it's possible that homosexuality is normal, and yet it still doesn't make sense to call a same-sex couple a marriage. They still have a whole other mountain to climb to prove that two people of the same gender getting together ought to be called and defined as a marriage, and they can't take a step in that direction either. Same-sex couples are engaged in perverse behavior, and they can never procreate with one another. How can that be nature's definition of what a marriage is? Isn't marriage nature's way of creating a family? They cannot procreate with one another nature's way in any way, shape, or form. Now, the only way to get to the term gay marriage, which we ought to consider a contradiction in terms, by the way, there is no such thing as gay marriage in nature. The only way to get to that term is to take the usual definition of marriage. You can only procreate with a heterosexual couple, and then say, we're going to extend the definition of marriage to include a same-sex couple. Now, in order to do that, you have to have a different definition of marriage than nature does. What reason can anybody give to trump nature's definition of marriage and substitute a different one that's contrary to what nature defines? Well, if the only reason you're doing this, I don't think there's any reason, the only reason you're doing it is for some political purpose, that's not a good enough reason to trump nature's definition of what marriage is. Someone says, well, you know, a gay couple could adopt, so now it can be a family. But adoption is a human invention. nature's definition of a marriage is. A guy having sex with an animal could theoretically adopt. That doesn't make that a marriage, does it? So we can't bring adoption into it and artificially produce a family in a way that nature can't produce a family. Someone will say, well, heterosexuals sometimes can't procreate. There are some heterosexual couples that can't procreate for some physical reason. But everybody knows the difference between the fact that in a heterosexual situation there can be occasionally anomalies and the fact that with a homosexual couple it's always impossible for them to procreate. Obviously, nature's only way of procreating is with heterosexual sex. There is no other way as far as nature is concerned. So when it comes to gay marriage, the first thing you should think is this. That's a contradiction in terms. Because in nature, there is no such thing as a gay marriage. I would like to call it an imitation marriage. It's the best that a homosexual couple can do to imitate what a real marriage is according to nature's definition, but it is not itself a marriage as far as nature is concerned. It's a pale, sick shadow of what a real marriage is, but it is not a marriage itself. Maybe I can throw some thoughts in here too. I didn't really plan this, but I thought about this. People want you to believe, and the gay rights movement wants you to think, and I've heard this repeated many times because I watch way too much television. Right, Phil? That children growing up with a gay couple as their parents, we don't see anything wrong with them. So what's your complaint about that? Wait a minute. First of all, we haven't had enough time to study that because there haven't been enough gay couples who've had children to study this over any long term. So right away, I'm suspicious. Number two, just because somebody doesn't turn out to be a bank robber doesn't mean that they've gotten all that they could get in a different situation. And number three, we already have studies that have shown that when you have a father and a mother, the father has his own influence of maleness on the child, and the mother has her own influence of femaleness on the child. Are we throwing all those studies away? That say there is an important influence that both genders have on the child that isn't going to be true in a same-sex situation. I think the differences between a healthy kid and a non-healthy kid maybe some of them so subtle that you can't measure them. And how do you measure something that's missing? Okay, so this kid is not a bank robber, but how do you know what they're missing that they could have had? So I don't buy into the idea, I think it's way too early anyway for any objective study on this thing, that children of a gay couple, why they turn out just as well. I'm really suspicious of that.